Holy cow! I don't know about you, but I just had a eureka moment. Although this is not a literal translation, since I'm inserting what I think Paul was thinking, it makes the most sense of all possibilities, which I'll look at here in just a moment. Christians are often heard screaming, "You're taking it out of context!" Well, if we consider the context of our verse, we'll discover it has nothing to do with Jesus being born, or living on earth, or countering the ideas of Docetism, for example, or any gospel fictions, but has everything to do with reconciling faith in Jesus, the new idea of Paul's day, with keeping the Mosaic laws, the old burdensome idea of pleasing God. It's inescapable logic. If mankind had not sinned, and specifically Eve, Jesus would not have been needed. Compare these options for explaining the vague reference made of woman. Option 1. Paul simply intended to tell us that Jesus was born like everyone else, right in the middle of talking about the Mosaic Law and how it related to this new idea of faith in Jesus. This is silly, but is this how he would have written it, using genomenon, meaning made, instead of genao, meaning born? Or how about option 2? Paul knew Jesus was a real human, but some people during his day denied this and claimed that Jesus was not fully human, but a phantasm. He just looked human, and he walked and he talked and he ate, or so it looked, but he wasn't really human. So Paul chose to insert his anti-docetic attack right in the middle of a discussion about how the law relates to faith in Jesus, still ridiculously out of context. But what an opportunity he missed by using the word gune, or woman, instead of the name Mary. Why, he could have written much more to prove that Jesus lived on earth as a real human being, yet this is all we get? Made of woman? Not much of an anti-docetic attack. What about option 3? This was inserted later by an Orthodox Christian wanting to shore up Jesus' humanity. Same argument. This later Orthodox interpolator gravely missed his chance by not naming Mary and Jesus' brothers, and so on. You get the idea. Or, how about option 4? Paul was saying that Jesus was made known to mankind, finally, during Paul's day, ultimately because of Eve and the law. Eve brought sin into the world. The law was given that sin may abound and point people to Jesus. These two, Eve and the law, brought about the death of Jesus. And Paul mentions several times in his letters that Jesus' sacrifice overcame death once and for all, which Eve brought into the world. And the sacrifice of Jesus also liberated and redeemed people from the suffocating Mosaic law. Option 4 makes perfect sense. But brought into history under the law sounds as if it is Jesus who is under the law. The Greek word hypo can also have a time aspect to it, and it can also be rendered as by instead of under. But in this verse, the grammar doesn't really allow for a time element or a causal preposition such as by, so we must stick with the rendering made under law or made under the law. But is Paul actually saying that Jesus was himself under the Mosaic law? This is what I think Paul is actually saying. Jesus was made to appear due to Eve's sin, and made to appear under the law or during the time when the Mosaic law was still in effect. In the same way Paul can say, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, it is obvious that Paul doesn't mean that Jesus is included in that set of all have sinned. Paul can also be imprecise with his wording, writing less than he actually knows, and we still understand that he means Jesus was revealed during a time when the Mosaic law was in effect, but was himself never under the Mosaic law. For one, Jesus was never on earth, I claim, but I have a much better argument for supporting the idea that Paul did not believe Jesus was under the Mosaic law himself. And interestingly, the solution comes in the very next phrase, the first part of verse 5. I'll include verse 4 and put some notes in brackets. But when the fullness of time had come, Paul's day, God sent forth, revealed via Scripture, His Son, made of a woman, brought into history by Eve's original sin, made under the law, revealed while the law was still in effect, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Well, well, well. If Jesus was under the Mosaic law, He'd be redeeming Himself now, wouldn't He? Clearly, Paul doesn't include Jesus in the set of people who were under the law. The idea is that Jesus was never on earth. He was a heavenly being, just like God, a heavenly high priest. Jesus was not under the law. He was not tainted with sin. Jesus was never human. He was never on earth, and Paul never even hints as much. Paul spends a lot of ink in both Romans and Galatians trying to explain how he reconciles faith in Jesus with obedience to the Mosaic law. In fact, he seems kind of obsessed with it. He uses the word law in his letter to the Romans over 70 times. And in Galatians, which is a little over a third the length of Romans, he uses it over 30 times. And his entire approach for mentioning the law so often isn't to remind people that they should be adhering to it, but he's trying to make a case that faith in Jesus allows you to sort of bypass keeping the law, and, well, no one could keep it anyway. And this new loophole given to them by Yahweh is a lot more convenient. Hey, just have faith, man. Paul believed that the law was not put in place to justify anyone, but its purpose was, in fact, to expose people's sins and steer them toward Jesus. Paul even intimates that Jesus had nothing to do with the law. Wherefore, by works of law shall no flesh be declared righteous before Him, that is God. For through law is a knowledge of sin. And now, Paul's day, apart from law hath the righteousness of God been manifested. In other words, Jesus' sacrifice was made known to mankind via the Old Testament passages and had nothing to do with the law, testified to by the law and the prophets, which all resided in, wait for it, the Old Testament passages. Good old Scripture. Nowhere outside of Galatians 4:4's murky reference does Paul write that Jesus himself was under the Mosaic law or bound by it. You'd think in his more than 100 references to the law in just Romans and Galatians, he would have at least hinted that Jesus himself kept the laws and kept all of them so that he would be found sinless before God and become the perfect sacrifice. Yet, that idea is only to be found in the Gospels, which are later Christian fictions. Paul clearly says that keeping the law does not make one just before God. So even if Jesus was on earth and could avoid breaking all of the Mosaic laws, it would not justify him in God's eyes, according to Paul. But again, Paul never mentions Jesus being bound by the law, fulfilling the law, or keeping the Mosaic law. Those who were under law were to be redeemed from the law by Jesus, redeemed from the law of sin and death, since apparently God couldn't simply do it himself. Jesus himself was clearly not under the Mosaic law in Paul's mind, or Jesus would then need to redeem himself and also violate the idea that keeping the law made one just in God's eyes. All of this makes even more sense if Paul believed Jesus was never on earth in the first place. Not human, but the offspring of a God who resided in heaven with his Father and would appear on earth at the end of time for the first time. Jesus' appearance inside the Old Testament scriptures during Paul's day, this coming of faith, was revealed to the likes of Paul during the first century, brought about by one woman's sin and God's true purpose for the law, a tutor designed to lead people to faith in Jesus rather than the Mosaic law. Jesus' very existence can be attributed to one woman, and that woman isn't Mary. So let's rewrite this another way. Brought onto the stage of history because of Eve, brought onto the stage of history while mankind was still under the law. Paul believed that his day and age was the time when God was revealing Jesus and his sacrifice to special messengers from the pages of Scripture. God sent forth his Son sounds like it might refer to the virgin birth, God sending Jesus from heaven to live on earth, but this would be to insert the gospel story into Paul's letter, where there is a paucity of gospel details to say the least. God sent forth the Spirit of Jesus into the hearts of believers via revelation from the Old Testament Scriptures. And I contend that verse 4 is saying the exact same thing. God sent forth his Son. God revealed his Son to mankind through the pages of Scripture during Paul's day. Psalms 22, Isaiah 53, and so on. So in summary, using perfectly valid definitions for each Greek word and a little logic, we have uncovered a completely different meaning, but one that is so perfectly Paul that I wonder why I didn't think of it before. Let me finish by pretending to be Paul and saying it from Paul's perspective.
At the end of this age, now that God is ready, he has revealed Jesus to special messengers like me, apostolos. He has sent his Son forth into the world via revelation from the pages of Scripture. He has revealed to us his Son, whose purpose was brought about by the sin of one woman, Eve. Jesus, whose act of sacrifice was made known to us while we were yet sinners and still under the harsh taskmaster of the Mosaic law. Jesus has been revealed to the whole world via Scripture, so that mankind might be redeemed from the disobedient act of one woman and the law of sin and death.